people. But that's okay, we can work with this. So, hi, my name's Mike Langlois, and I'm a clinical social worker, and I also do psychotherapy. And it's really a privilege to be here today and speaking with you. And let me tell you a couple reasons why it's a privilege. One is because I love every time I get a chance to talk with and listen to gamers talk about gaming. And I'm certainly going to make sure that my presentation leaves a lot of time so that you can hopefully ask questions. The other reason it's a real privilege to be here is that the way I got into working with people that play video games and working with people and thinking about rethinking video game addiction started at PAX East a little while back when it was at the Heinz Convention Center. And I remember coming to the Heinz Convention Center and feeling really inspired by the level of interest and engagement and the level of cosplay and all of the energy that comes from this particular venue. And it's hard to be in the presence of this particular community and not question the way people pathologize gaming sometimes, because we all are normal to us, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about video games. We're going to talk a little bit about the psychology about video games, and I'm going to ask us to rethink what we mean by video game addiction. And I'm going to do a quick survey. You don't have to raise your hand, but you're welcome to. How many of you identify as gamers? Raise your hand. Awesome. Hey, how many of you identify yourself as drug addicts? Raise your hand. All right. And how many of you identify yourself as gaming addicts or addicted to video games? Raise your hands. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot more. We have a lot easier time saying we're addicted to video games than we do to drugs and alcohol. But I'm going to ask us to maybe really rethink that a little bit. So, so who I am, as I said, is a psychotherapist, and what I do is I basically work with people that are ages 12 to 52, 62, 72, who use video games, and either they play them themselves and they want to talk with a therapist who understands video games a little bit, or maybe their partner has said, you play video games too much and you need to go to therapy, or a parent has called and said, my kid's playing video games too much and he needs to talk with you. And so I get people that play video games from a whole number of different places. And I've done a little poll about how many people were gamers, drug addicts, or video game addicts. Are there any other therapists out here? Okay. So see these people after the show. So one of the things I do in addition to this is educate people about how to think about technology and video games differently. We're going to do a little of that today. But first, I want us to engage in an MMHP, which is short for Massively Multiplayer Human PowerPoint. And this, in fact, is going to be a world record. This is going to be the biggest ever Massively Multiplayer Human PowerPoint that I have ever seen. So I'm going to need 3 volunteers. Okay, you in the back, and you in the red shirt, sir. So these 3 people are going to be your human PowerPoints. Please come to the front. All right. Stand and face the audience, please. Stand and face the audience, please. Stand and face the audience, please. Okay. So, when I say go, I'm going to ask you to carefully get up and go to one point of the room. Either you over here, you in the middle, or you in the back. You can run a little bit, okay? Okay, absolutely. All right? And I'm going to ask you all to go to one of these 3 groups, or just stand up and work with them, and I want you to try to figure out what these slides mean, okay? So that when we do the human PowerPoint, we can actually make sense of this. Ready? Go.
Where are we going? Where do you want to go? I'm with you.
We can split up, or I don't know. Let's check out this number. All right.
Make sure you hold it high so everyone can read it. Holding the human PowerPoint slide, I want you to start taking the answer that you think is the best, because you'll be the person that speaks for everybody. Okay? No pressure, but you got to do it right.
I'd like to think 3 is up there, but I think it might have to extend a little bit faster.
Okay, human PowerPoints to me. This is like Avengers Assemble. Human PowerPoints, come back. Hello, human PowerPoint. And where's our third human PowerPoint? Let the human PowerPoint back here, or we won't be able to continue with the presentation. Come back, human PowerPoint. Come back. Those of you who couldn't see, they were mobbing the other human PowerPoint. All right.
I don't know, I didn't see it.
There's a way to go.
All right, so human PowerPoint number 1 takes center stage. Human PowerPoint slide, you say, this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls because they will not use their memories. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. What did you decide you meant?
We believed after discussion that it implies that as consumers of entertainment, be it video games or television, we essentially go about consuming as much of it as we possibly can and obtaining the information that it goes into it, but we take nothing from it. It's almost like we get it done, it gets discarded quickly, move on to the very next thing, therefore we don't actually learn anything from what we take in. We hear all of it, but we take in nothing that we gain from it.
Wow. That was a really articulate answer, and it's not even close.
You're the worst team ever.
No, you're not the worst team. That was not the most epic fail. This is a famous quote. Okay, this is a famous quote by somebody. It is a quote from Socrates. And this quote was what Socrates was reported to have said about the people of Athens learning how to read. Socrates didn't want people to learn how to read because he was afraid that it would create forgetfulness in learners' souls and it would make them less likely to seek out a teacher to teach them things. So Socrates didn't want you, human PowerPoint number 1, to actually learn how to read.
I don't like the way you just think of it.
Well, I don't either. But the point of this slide is that there has always been a lot of suspicion towards new developing technologies. That even back in Athens, way back when, people were very suspicious that any new technology would actually change your brain. Okay? So the idea that a new technology is going to change your brain, make you distracted, make you forgetful, does that sound familiar to you?
No.
Because, okay, that's my point. Thank you, PowerPoint number 1. Thank you.
Yeah!
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So number 2, PowerPoint number 2, you were supposed to help people come up with activities that are good to do constantly for 8 hours. So what did you come up with?
The most common answer was sleeping, and we weren't sure of anything else besides breathing. Somebody said working, but I wasn't sure about constantly for 8 hours.
Good. Well, so you did a good job with your group keeping them in order. Sleep is definitely one of the answers. The 2 that I've been able to come up with the help of my dog are these 2. And the 2 things that are good to do constantly for 8 hours are definitely sleep and maybe meditation. Maybe meditation. But the point is, a lot of times when people talk with people about video games, they say, well, how many hours a week are you playing? Or how many hours a night are you playing? as if a person's doing it constantly, and as if doing anything constantly for 8 hours, with the exception of sleeping, is a good thing. And that most things that you do for 8 hours aren't a good thing if you're doing them constantly. So that is the point of PowerPoint slide number 2. Thank you. Round of applause for you. And last but not least, to PowerPoint slide number 3. Can you please tell us what you decided the meaning of 0.00019999999999999999996% is?
We decided that this was the percentage of the population that has been legitimately diagnosed with gaming addiction.
Oh, what an interesting answer. It's not the right one. But No. That's the answer is 0.000199999999999999996. I practiced that. Percent is the percentage of WoW World of Warcraft related infanticides in the year 2005. You might know it much better by the popular media story that came out about a Korean couple that were playing video games in an internet cafe and their child died as a result of their neglect. It sounds very sensational when you look at it that way, but when you look at the population in 2005, which was 6.5 billion, and you look at the population of WoW at that time, which was 5 million, the percentage of WoW-related infanticides, which was this one couple, even if you could directly attribute it to their gameplay, would be 0.0000199999999999996%.
Are we supposed to get that? Are we supposed to actually answer it? Like, get that right answer?
You get a pawn in a much greater game. Thank you. So my point is, that number is kind of a funny number, but it's also a really boring number. And the media doesn't like boring numbers. The media likes things that are much more sensational and grab our attention. So a couple let infants starve to death in arcade playing WoW sounds a lot better. But relative to the number of people in the world and the number of people playing World of Warcraft, it is a statistically insignificant number of people. So that even if you could directly tie those two events together, it's very small and it isn't really a trend. Which brings me to, is there a way to get the lights here? I don't know if people can see. Can you all read?
Nope. I'm blind as a bat.
We're going to have one of the enforcers get the lights. Go enforcers. All right, I'm not sure we're going to want to keep it that way forever. Is there happy medium? Is there something in between? That is it. Okay, so this brings us to what I want to talk about with stigmas about technology. And these are stigmas that I work with both therapists trying to unlearn, but people that come to see me as patients. And the stigmas we have about technology are myriad. Some of them include, it's less than face-to-face contact, it's too complicated to understand, technology is too boring to listen to teens or adults about, technology gets in the way of real relationships, technology distracts from therapy and from listening to adults or partners in general, and technology is for kids who have poor social skills. Back when I used to work in the public school system, I'd often have teachers come up to me and say, you know, I think this student is on the autistic spectrum. And I'd say, okay, well, what makes you think that they might fit that diagnosis? And they go, well, they spend a lot of time on the computer. As if everyone that spends time on the computer happens to have autism or some other form of neurological concern. So I think that that speaks to how a lot of the people that are in charge of determining what our diagnoses are in the world aren't necessarily really hip to technology and in fact stigmatize it a lot. So I wanted us to take a look at some of these so that hopefully if you hear them in your regular life, you can question them, because I certainly do. So part of the reason we have this stigma is because we've had a change in form and a change in function when it comes to video games. How many people can remember this back in the day game?
Yes.
What is it? Right. Okay? That was when it was you and the TV, and you were like this. Right? Can anyone recognize this one? Yeah. Which is it?
Call of Duty Zombies.
Yes. Okay. But close. So these games are actually really different. It's not us sitting in front of the computer. Okay? It's actually us sitting in front of a console, but also playing with headphones, texting, talking with other people. And the problem is that when people that don't play video games think about video games, they think of this, when in fact, they need to be thinking more about this. And that they need to be thinking about the fact that there are other real people on the other side of that screen, that people are beaming in by the thousands to participate in multiplayer virtual games, which are highly social experiences. And I have patients that talk about playing with kids, that there are other kids after school. I have patients that are adults that have a Thursday night guild or a Thursday night raid, that have all sorts of social needs being met through the virtual medium of video games. And one of the things that we don't necessarily take into account is that video games are a form of social media. That back when we played Pong, they weren't as much a form of social media. But now video games are as much a form of social media, I would put to you, as Facebook, Twitter, or other forms of social media. And we need to start thinking about them that way. The other reason that people tend to have some stigmas about video games has to do with something called task switching. And people may be familiar with Minecraft. I hope you are. If not, you need to play it. It's a great game. These are different things in Minecraft. That is a furnace, that is a crafting machine. And one of the things people learn pretty quickly when they're playing Minecraft is to park a whole bunch of ore in the furnace so that you can be smelting it while you're doing something else. And that is a model of task switching. That is a model of the human brain's ability to do multiple tasks at the same time, but bring different tasks to the foreground and different tasks in the background. Those of us who have used PCs and have looked at Task Manager know what we're talking about. That the human brain is like that. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on, even if they're not in the front of our conscious. And we're not necessarily conscious of all of these things because we use that task switching function of changing the foreground. Now, what does this have to do with the stigma of video games? Here's what it has to do. When you play a video game, as the person in this picture is, you manage to do a switch, which is that you switch the foreground in your mind. So this isn't what you're experiencing, but this is. The foreground is switched, and now you are playing the video game. This is the world, this is the reality that you are dealing with, this is what you're responding to. Unfortunately, to the people that look at us playing video games, they see this. So they don't understand that what you're doing isn't looking at an object as much as having a virtual experience. Okay? And that's why they talk about it as distracting. That's why they talk about it as escapism. But what if it's not escapism? Because escaping has moral overtones of cowardice and avoidance. How many of us have heard the idea of video games are being used to escape from reality? Right? But what if it's not escapism? What if we took a more neutral or even affirming stance? What if gaming is actually focusing on something rather than escaping from something? What if playing a video game is actually a choice to evoke a concentration meditation state? That there is a form of meditation that's known as concentration meditation. It's one of the ways we practice mindfulness. And it involves your being focused on an object. It can be a work of art, it can be a candle, it can be a rock, it can be a walk, but you focus on one thing. And when we're playing video games, we're focusing on one thing. And so I'd like you to actually start entertaining the thought and spreading the word to other people that maybe playing video games isn't about escapism at all, or primarily. Maybe it's actually about focusing on something and training our mind to concentrate. Part of the reason we need to concentrate, and part of the reason we have problems with people that don't like us when we play video games, has to do with this little fact. And this little fact is that our brains are processing about 11 million bits of information per second. Yet we're conscious of only 40 bits Okay, so of the 11 million bits of information that you are processing every second I'm talking to you, you're conscious of only about 40 bits. And so what happens between partners and parents and kids and people that play games and people that don't play games is the competition for those 40 bits becomes pretty powerful. That we want to be the people that are in charge of the 40 bits, that we want people to be paying attention to us. Now, I tend to like visual examples, and I tend to like Skyrim. So what I decided to do was give you an example of what 40 out of 11 million bits would look like if you were playing Skyrim. So breaking it down by pixels, approximately, if you can find the red dot here. Can you find the red dot?
No.
No. It's in the top where?
Top left-hand corner.
Very good. You rock the house. I can't even see it, and I know it's there. Okay? Okay? So that would be 1 bit. But wait a minute. This is actually only 2 million bits. So 40 out of 11 million would more look like finding the red dot in this. Okay? There's a whole lot of stuff going on in here that we're not necessarily always conscious of. And there's a huge competition being made by workers and co-workers and partners and spouses and everybody for those 40 bits. And that's why it can often get so ugly when people are playing video games and they're task switching and their mind is foregrounding one thing and people want those 40 bits somewhere else. This is why people get into fights when they're playing video games and someone comes in. I was in a guild once, and we were playing, we were raiding in World of Warcraft, and this was back in Burning Crusade, and our tank kept going offline. We were playing, and he went offline, get disconnected, came back and he said, my 3-year-old just pulled the plug on my computer. So he plugged back in, and we were raiding it again, and then he got unplugged again. And the third time this happened, we suggested to him as a guild that maybe that was the 3-year-old's way of telling him that the 3-year-old wanted a little more time and attention, that he should stop and we'd find another tank from a pug or something. But what happens is, if you do get interrupted, it can take up to half an hour for you to get your concentration back. And what I try to encourage people to do when thinking about concentration this way is to think about the creeper in Minecraft. How many of you know about the creeper? Okay, that's good, that's reassuring. So you know how when you're running around and all of a sudden you hear the rustling and the creeper explodes and kills you and all of your loot goes everywhere, and suddenly you're halfway across the world and you have to run back in 5 minutes or whatever to get the loot? That's your concentration. And when somebody interrupts you, that's them being the creeper. And you have to be able to start... in my household, I'm the creeper. Actually, disclose that. And actually, you need to start being able to identify people in your work and in your love life and in your personal life that may actually be creepers, that may actually be disrupting you, and try to manage to figure out a way to negotiate with them. Now, you would think from all of my conversation about concentration, that I'm not a big fan of distraction, and you'd actually be really wrong. Because one of the things that my colleague Howard Langlois talks about is how distraction is an important ability and a survival skill. That if you were walking off the sidewalk and you didn't have the cognitive ability to be distracted by a car horn, you'd get poomed and you would die. And so that there's this big push in a lot of mental health and a big push in a lot of public health to talk about concentration and the need for concentration. And in fact, the need for distraction is equally important in some ways. That we wouldn't survive if we weren't able to distract ourselves. Because remember what I said about task switching? That's something that we do deliberately, but sometimes we need something from the world to get us to switch our task back. So if you're thinking I'm against distraction, I'm actually not. I'm really in favor of it. And part of the reason I'm saying this is that sometimes when people say video games are a distraction, my response is, well, yeah, we probably need to be distracted a little bit once in a while for our mental health to survive. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the psychological dimension of video games. And I also want to say, because I'm aware the slides are a little bit hard to read, that I'll be posting this Prezi so that you can actually have access to it and see it. So it's something, you can't read it, you can take a look at it online. But for now, let's talk a little bit about what actually happens to our mind and how we actually experience video games. And the way we tend to experience them is through our character. And the character is the embodied representation of the patient or the person. Okay? So the way we experience the world of the video game is through our character. We gain experience in the game through our character. We accumulate knowledge and skills and resources all through our character. And like other forms of development, we players gain instrumental value of their character over time. I was a horrible mage when I started out. Okay? But my character, through time and practice and resources, got better. And one of the things that players do in the video game is use the character to practice. The other things about video games that have a psychological component is that players feel very connected psychologically to their character, often keeping the same one for months or for years. Characters are the medium through which players experience social interaction in the game. Players transact their relationships through virtual characters, not only in the game, but also through instant messaging, through guild chat, through emails, and over voice internet protocol networks. And that if you think about your guild, or if you think about the people that you play Xbox with, you may know their gamer tag, but you may not actually know their actual name of them as a person in the world. And so often we only have connection to these other people through the medium of their character. But that medium is important, and that medium counts. And that people have real relationships, even though they're mediated through a specific character. And that's one of the reasons we're so attached to our characters. Quick show of hands before I go into this slide. How many of you have played World of Warcraft or another MMO? Okay. How many of you have had an alt that's languishing for a while that you feel guilty about? Yeah. Okay. That's a sign of attachment. Okay. Any of us who've ever had any relationship knows guilt is a sign of attachment. Okay? So that is an example of, if you think about it, this is a collection of pixels, a collection of data, and yet you have a feeling of guilt connected to the fact that you haven't been leveling that rogue enough. How are we going to open all those chests? Nobody wants to do that in the auction house in Stormwood. Anyway, psychological benefits of MMOs. Okay, because players rely on others for training, information, and resources, that gives rise to robust communities. In the video game world, World of Warcraft, or Rift, or Guild Wars 2, we need each other. We need each other to do tasks that we can't do specifically ourselves. And so my point again is that 21st century gaming is inherently social. MMOs would not work if video games were not inherently social. We would not have the popularity of first-person shooters like Call of Duty if it wasn't inherently social. And gaming actually encourages productivity, because if you think about how people spend a lot of their time playing video games, producing things, selling things, creating things, that actually is a way that we are being productive. And my tendency is to try to get patients to figure out how to generalize that to the real world, rather than how to stop doing that and do something else in the real world. Because in the video game is actually the seeds of how we can have the potential to do things in the real world, because it is the real world. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of video games, and one of them is social games. And some of the psychological benefits of social games in particular are their educational potential, their ability to foster critical thinking, the development of social skills that come from social games, development of economic and strategic thinking that comes from playing social games, and they promote learning in low-income communities. And I think this is probably one of the most important pieces, that one of the things that's most powerful about social games, whether they be on Facebook or some other platform that we have access to, is that it cuts across all classes. That when we took a look, the Pew Internet Research Group took a look at the use of technology, they actually found that regardless of your race or economic status, we had a pretty level use of technology. And in fact, people in Latino populations had a higher use of smartphone technology. So social games and games that are accessed through these technologies have a great deal of potential to bring education to people in lower income economic status. In terms of first-person shooters, I didn't used to talk about first-person shooters. Quick show of hands. Raise your hand if you play first-person shooters. Okay, okay. So let me do a little confession. One of the things that I did when I first started working as a gamer affirmative therapist is I actually used that term, gamer affirmative therapist, to parallel the liberation movement of the LGBT population. That for a long time, people that happen to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender were marginalized by the psychological profession. And people needed to advertise themselves as gay affirmative therapists so that they could signal to potential clients that they wouldn't be considered diseased just because they were coming in and they happened to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. That a lot of times people wanted to come in and they didn't want to talk about their sexual orientation, they just happened to have a sexual orientation that was part of who their life was and they wanted to talk about something else. By the same token, I would call myself a gamer affirmative therapist, which means that not everyone wants to come in and talk with me about gaming, but they want to know that I'm not going to immediately pathologize it. That the first words out of my mouth aren't going to be, how many hours are you doing that? The minute somebody says to you, how many hours are you doing that, you know they've already judged it. Because when you say, well, I like reading Dickens' Bleak House at night, no one says, oh, how many hours are you reading? So now, to go back to the LGBT parallel, that one of the transgender community has consistently had a difficult time finding itself part of that LGBT community. That as the LGBT community got more gains in terms of civil rights and recognition, they started to have a harder time bringing along the transgender part because they would have feelings that they were somehow holding them back, that their public image wasn't as good because of whatever the transgender population happened to be bringing to the table. We've gotten better at that, but why I'm telling you this is that first-person shooters are the transgender of the gaming community. Right? Everyone talks about, we all talk about how games help us be collaborative, we all talk about how games help us share and cooperate and learn, and nobody wants to talk about the first-person shooters. No one wants to talk about Call of Duty because that's going to be where we start going down the rabbit hole of violence. And so we start to distance ourselves from people that play first-person shooters. We either don't talk about them, or we don't acknowledge that we play first-person shooters as much as we play social games. Minecraft is a lot more politically correct because it's non-violent in the same way. And we need to take back first-person shooters. And I'm saying that as somebody that used to avoid talking about them, partly because of this. And one of the things I noticed when I actually started looking at my own first-person shooter phobia was that there was a lot of research out there that we need to be able to tell people about in terms of what first-person shooters do to our own cognitive skills in a good way. And those include improving your spatial motor skills, developing and improving selective attention, improving strategic thinking and impulse control. And this is the one that I educate people the most about because it's the one that's the most counterintuitive. But when you are trying to snipe somebody, you need to be able to control the impulse to shoot before it's actually the right moment. And playing a first-person shooter requires you to develop impulse control. They also create opportunities for flow experiences, where I'll be talking about in a sec. And in fact, we've done some recent studies with veterans who have PTSD and that have indicated that playing first-person shooters may in fact provide nightmare protection. That people that play first-person shooters noted and reported a decreased amount of nightmares than their colleagues who didn't play them. And last but not least, first-person shooters increase processing speed and decrease reaction time. And I can tell you, I'm never feeling as slow and stupid as when I'm playing Call of Duty or another FPS with one of my patients. And I can see every day how their visual-spatial motor skills are actually increasing. And it's because they're practicing an FPS every day, and I don't have time because I do things like this. This has killed my video game. Last but not least, in terms of this. Yes, this person may look familiar. This is the DC Online version of Super Mario. And I use Super Mario to illustrate an avatar and one of the psychological benefits of gaming that we've studied. Nick Yee of the Palo Alto group had coined the term the Proteus effect. And what Nick discovered in 2007 was that if you did avatar interaction if you played through an avatar that you perceived as powerful or attractive or big, you actually, for less than 90 seconds, you actually experienced an increase of self-confidence that lasted 6 hours. The people that played for 90 seconds behind a powerful avatar experienced an increase of confidence that came up to 6 hours. Which is why, if you have people that are having a difficult time going to work, or students that are having a difficult time going to school, the trick isn't to give them a reward when they get there. The trick is to get them to get up a half an hour early and play video games for a half an hour before going. Because that's when you actually, yes, I know, the parents are wincing when I say that. But in fact, that's the way you achieve a psychological benefit that increases confidence and ability. The problem we have with giving people rewards when they get to work is by then it's really too late. If all they needed was a reward at work, they would be there already, right? If all they needed was a reward at school, they'd be there. So front-loading this is taking advantage of what Nikki calls the Proteus effect, which is 90 seconds in front of an avatar, and you will feel more confident for up to 6 hours. So I want us to talk a little bit about whether the experience we have when we play video games is a drug or a flow. And this is a trick question, it's a setup, because when we describe what a flow experience is, we have several criteria. People that are in a flow report that they have an ability to concentrate more. They report a loss of feeling of self-consciousness. They report a distorted sense of time, direct and immediate feedback in their environment, a sense of personal control over a situation. The activity they're doing at the time feels effortless. They have a lack of awareness of bodily needs, and they have a sense of absorption into the activity. Okay? And that is something that if you think about drug or alcohol use or playing a video game, both of them have those components to it. But because a component is similar, doesn't mean that they have the same moral valence. That doesn't mean they're the same thing. That sometimes it's actually a strength to be able to concentrate more. Okay? Although when people are abusing stimulants or using cocaine and it's helping them with their concentration, that's not necessarily the best way to deal with it. But all of these things are examples of flow states, states that there are dozens of textbooks and psychological books trying to help you learn how to get into. But if you break down what a flow state is, it starts to look an awful lot like some of the states that we criticize when we're talking about substance use, or that we criticize when we talk about video games. So the point of this slide is to basically help you see that just because you can call something, just because you can label a phenomenon doesn't make it bad. Okay? Just because you can label a phenomenon does not make it bad. So let's get to what my title was, which is addiction. Is playing video games an addiction? Can it be an addiction? From a clinical point of view, no, at least not yet. That the way we tend to diagnose people with any sort of mental health concerns is using the DSM-4 or the DSM-5 for a diagnosis. That when you go to a therapist or you go to get some mental health, if you're using your insurance, there needs to be some sort of diagnosis. There needs to be a reason for the clinical encounter. And what we do know is that there is no diagnosis currently for internet or gaming addiction. And that there's been a lot of overlapping or conflicting or biased definition of terms. And that part of the reason there isn't a definition of internet addiction that's in the DSM-5 is because a lot of us are arguing about it. Some of us, like me, don't think it actually should be in the DSM-5, and other people think it should. But these two folks, Kim and Karadakis, in 2008, reviewed many of the different theories we have on addiction and suggested that actually internet addiction, or internet or gaming addiction, manifested in different ways from other addictions in substances and alcohol. They looked and identified 3 dimensions of internet addiction. They looked at how individuals that may have had what they considered internet addiction experienced intrusion, experienced a sense of escaping reality, or experienced a difficulty with attachment. But even when they looked at it that way, they were clear to say that it's fundamentally different. We're noticing fundamentally different things than substances, addictions to substances. As I said, there's no existing clinical criteria put forth by the American Psychiatric Association or the American Medical Association, so you can't diagnose something if you don't have a criteria for it. But the criteria that we have when we talk about gaming addiction tends to be adapted from gambling screens. tests that were run on people that were trying to look at their gambling. And the problem with that is that gambling is very different. For one thing, high levels of engagement elevate the positives for addiction, meaning that the more you gamble, the more you're considered to be addicted. Whereas it's not necessarily the same for gaming. But more important, another key difference is that for the most part, video game playing doesn't involve financial risk and reward, loss and stress, which gambling does. You're never trying to make back that big loss that you had in a financial way, which is exactly what gambling addiction is all about. And then substance abuse addictions and other addictions are generally characterized by huge debt, severe health consequences, and legal troubles. And that most people that describe themselves as addicted to video games do not report themselves as having huge debts, severe health consequences, and legal troubles. And in fact, the reason those stories are so popular in the media when one of them comes up is because they don't happen that often. So that there are certainly outliers where people may be having some health problems as a result of staying seated too long. But for the most part, when people are identifying themselves as video game addicts, we're not seeing the same sorts of extreme situations as that we're seeing with people that are using substance abuse or addiction, or alcohol or other addictions. So why am I going on about this? That was probably the most boring part of the presentation. But the reason I'm going on about this is that a diagnosis is important. And why it's important is because the treatment of a condition varies greatly depending on what the diagnosis is. If you come in and you tell me that you've got a fever and that you've got cramps, and I decide that instead of appendicitis, you have the flu, because both of those symptom sets resemble each other, you might die. It's important when we call things an addiction that we get our terms straight, because the way we treat things is based on those terms. And one of the things that I've found is that people tend to call things an addiction, and we tend to, in our own gaming communities, use the term addiction fast and loose. And if I could ask you all to think about doing anything differently, it would be to really stop using the term addict in quite the same way. That we're using it in a very descriptive, tongue-in-cheek way, but there's such a confusion of tongues now as a result of it, that when you go into a therapist and you say, I'm addicted to video games, they're thinking about it from a DSM criteria, and you may be just using a description. So that's why I think this is important in terms of getting gaming right. So as you can probably tell by now, I really don't think the addiction model is a very useful one when we're talking with people that play video games. A model I think better is a model that takes into account these three facts. One, that time spent gaming is not equal to the existence of problem usage. The time you spend playing a video game is not equal to the existence of a problem. Number two, the time spent gaming is not equal to the acuity of a problem. Instead, what I think we need to start doing is asking what impact, positive or negative, does gaming have on the quality of a person's work, relationships, or self-esteem? Not how many hours you're playing, but what impact is this having on the quality of your life? That there are people that play video games for hours at a time, but they actually are guild leaders, and they experience an increased sense of competency, they've practiced their leadership skills, and actually the video game has actually enhanced their life. And then there are other people that may play a video game only a few hours a week, but they've noticed that it doesn't necessarily enhance their life. So whenever I talk with someone about looking at their video game usage, I always ask them to think about both the positive and the negative consequences. And it's really hard, I think, sometimes for people to see that there are positive consequences to playing video games. Not as much for you guys, because you play them, and you probably have seen how your life has been changed for the better. But in general, we tend to think that if you play a number of hours, that means there's a problem, and it's a big problem. All right, so now, having said that, there are things that you can look at in your life that can tell you whether or not maybe there is a problem with the amount of time you play. And that's what makes time suck a problem. Okay? Why time suck is a problem is because it can mean poor time management. It can be missed appointments, conflicts with others, internal or internalized guilt for wasting my time. Problem usage, however, since it doesn't equal addiction, we we need to take a look at whether the problem is the video game or whether the problem is that a person has poor time management skills in general. So you want to ask yourself, is my poor time management because I'm playing video game all the time, or do I have poor time management skills in general? And if the answer is that you have poor time management skills in general, you're not going to get the treatment you need or the help you need if you focus on the video game rather than building your time management skills, because that's the problem, and you're just going to find something else. You're going to end up reading Dickens too much, and you're just be late for work because of video game. So finally, we need to consider stigma and cultural competency. The majority of people that are therapists are not culturally competent in using technology and are unfortunately not culturally competent in terms of gaming and playing video games. All right. Fun fact for you all, 80% of the time we play a video game, we're failing. It's funny, but it's also powerful and important. And one of the reasons I mention this to therapists when I talk with them about this is therapists are always big on resilience. Okay, one of the things we're concerned with is fostering resilience in people. If people have experienced trauma, we want to figure out how they survived it, how they can be more resilient in their life, and how the quality of life in general can be better if we have an increased resilience. And one of the things I tell them is that they need to play more video games. And they need to get their patients to play more video games, because if when we're playing video games, we are failing 80% of the time, and we keep playing, that speaks to the fact that gamers are extremely resilient. That is a form of resilience, that we don't give up and that we keep playing again and again and again. Even when 80% of the time we're failing, that's a sign that we're resilient. So, you may have experienced some of these, and if you have, I'm sorry, and if you haven't, be on the lookout. If anyone in here ever goes to therapy, but these are some epic therapist fails in terms of working with patients that play video games. Technophobia is a huge fail. Boredom or the dismissal of the subject is a huge fail. Anytime you say to somebody, "Oh, I don't know anything about video games," what you're really conveying to them is disinterest and dismissal. If someone comes in and says, you know, I have a history of sexual abuse, and your therapist says, "Oh, I don't know anything about sexual abuse." We don't do that, right? We don't do that. And the reason we don't do that is because on some level we understand it's dismissal. You know, "Oh, I don't know anything about the Super Bowl." Okay, that's a form of dismissal. If my patient needs to talk about video games and I say, "Oh, I don't know anything about them," not only am I telling them I'm ignorant about it, but I'm telling them I really don't care that I'm ignorant about it. So that's an epic therapist fail. Now, I'm prey to the other ones, which is over-identifying the patient if you game. Okay? There have been times when I fished up the sea turtle in World of Warcraft, and I was just dying to have an opportunity to tell a patient about it. That sort of competition is not useful, and so I don't actually disclose that I fished up the sea turtle. If somebody else wants to talk about some other problems they're having, and they're like, "Oh, but how's the Minecraft going?" That is also an epic therapist fail. So that you can go in the other direction of this as well. And then last but not least, expressing some sort of competition. Unless you're doing play therapy, it's not usually very good. Okay? So when someone comes in and says, "I hit level 80 on my mage," and you say, "Oh, you know, actually, I remember when I hit level 80. That's a good feeling, huh?" That's actually what we call an empathic failure in business. All right, so that's the formal end of our presentation. I hope I've left plenty of time so that we can actually have some questions and some comments, because I find the most beneficial part of all this is really hearing from you. This is my contact information. If you are one of the folks that needs to run out instead of doing the Q&A, you know, I did write a book. It's postcards for it over there. Okay, feel free to get it. But please, we have a wireless mic. I'd love to entertain your questions.
7 minutes.
7 minutes. We have 7 minutes. Ask good questions.
If you guys, sorry.
That was
that was my fault. If you guys have questions, just like line up in front, please. It's a little bit easier.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to know when it was that you got started in kind of incorporating video games into your practice and how you kind of put that out there.
I actually started probably around 2007 and 2008, and I began incorporating it into my practice after PAX East that year.
So the first PAX East.
So the first PAX East, and one of the reasons I did that was when I saw so many people were okay talking about video games, I realized I needed to get better at talking about video games with my patients as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How do you help and treat a patient with video gaming addiction?
That's a hard one because I don't tend to think of video gaming addiction as something that's treated in the way that addiction implies. I'm much more interested in understanding what the video game means to the person, what the symbolic content of the video game is, and ways to generalize what they're doing in the game to be real important. That I don't think of it as, if anything, I'm interested in harm reduction rather than abstinence. I don't encourage patients to stop playing, and I don't send them off to detox.
That's right, thank you.
Hi, I actually had two questions, but if you're out of time, you can pick one.
Okay.
I guess one is I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how the web show The Guild portrays gaming addiction or strong attraction or association with WoW and guilds. And the other thing is I was wondering what you think about the pro gaming scene that's been sort of exploding, mostly because of these former pro gamers who have grown up and are now putting in a huge amount of effort and leadership into growing the...
Let me answer the first one about the Guild, because that's the easiest one. I love Felicia Day and the work she's doing. I think the Guild, the way I see it, is tongue firmly in cheek. I think the first scene, the first episode ever, when she's on the phone talking with her therapist, I think really sets the stage. That she's actually poking fun at the people that criticize video games as much, if not more, than the people that actually play them. So I'm all down with it. Thanks.
Hi, I was wondering if you have any studies on the effect of video games and personal levels of initiative, because inside a video game, things are often very streamlined and railroaded. You go here and then you go there next. And there isn't really much of a need for personal initiative, so I'm wondering if it affects personal initiative.
That's a great question, and in fact there is some interesting data. If you go to Nick Yee's website, the Daedalus Project, he has a database of, for example, about 1,100 people that play World of Warcraft. And what he discovered was that different classes, playing different classes, requires a different level of initiative. So for example, leveling a paladin to 80 requires a different level of initiative and stamina and patience than leveling a warlock. Apologies to warlocks, it doesn't mean they're anything less. But there's actually some connections when you look at the game mechanics and how long it takes for people to achieve certain things to the level of initiative people are willing to take. So there's stuff out there, and if you email me, I can give you more information. There's tons.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, I lived with my mother while I was going to college, and I have trouble explaining to her how video games helps me. She often says things to me like, you need to read more books to develop your character, and I'm like, I'm already in a story right now and playing Final Fantasy or something. Is there a way I can sort of get her to see that it's different mediums, but sort of still accomplishing the same thing?
Well, you can do a few things. I mean, if you want to, you can, the best thing, the thing I usually ask parents to consider to do the most is actually play video games with their kids or their adult kids. That if something is taking a lot of your child's time and you're finding it really, and they're finding it really valuable, why wouldn't you want to explore it a little bit? But I think that that's number one. There's also a bunch of different books out there if your mom's more of a reader that we could actually do. So if you want to send me an email, I can give you some of them.
Okay.
Jane McGonigal's Reality is Broken is a good one. I've got some stuff in my book that talks about that too.
Yeah, she often thinks I'm escaping reality, but you know, that's one of the, what was it you said, misconceptions.
Show her the Prezi when it comes out.
All right.
Thanks. Okay, who are you? I have to know who you are.
Ice
The
King.
Nice King.
I'm sorry. I don't get to play and know everything. Okay, what's the question?
Still trying to figure out exactly how to word this. I don't know if MMO players or even other like team-based FPS players get this, but I find that you were mentioning earlier games as social media. I find that when I used to play TF2, for example, there always seemed to be two groups of people socially. There were the normal people who they get in game and they ignore their team as like a social or strategic element in any way. They just get in and they click on commands to shoot them. And then there would be the people who are talking to each other. If when the latter group, tries to talk to someone in the former group, they think, this annoying nerd is interrupting me. Why? But why is it that gaming is, from the outside, gaming is antisocial, but once you're in the game, it's the people who are talking to each other, who are the uber nerds, while the normal people just sit there quietly, ignoring everyone, and just clicking on people to shoot.
I think that the answer to that question in part, and I don't want to get in trouble, because I love the way we've increased and improved game mechanics, and I love how we make it possible that people like me that don't have time to commit to a guild can find Raid Finder or find pickup groups. But Raid Finder and pickup groups are one of the main culprits of this, is that when you don't have a sense of social responsibility, when you have a mechanism in the game that you can just queue up and play with somebody else, it does make that bad habit. That one of the reasons that people do so well with TF2 or others is that they're being social. And so part of it, I do blame the game mechanics, that I think in order to monetize video games and make more people able to play deeper levels of endgame content, we've also eroded a little bit some of the social functions of it. People that are socially talking with each other, in my point of view, should be able to progress farther, because that's how humanity tends to work. That when we cooperate, we tend to progress farther. It's a great question. Thanks.
We're running out of time. Last question.
Last question, make it good.
Oh my goodness, here, actually I want you to do it.